Hello, everyone. Welcome to Lectora Live, your inside track into Lectora. I'm Rick Zanotti. We got a great show for you. Here we go. And we are back, and today we are joined by Scott Barnett. He is the Vice President of Marketing for Trivantis, makers of Lectora and Course Mill. And, we were joking a little bit earlier because we go to a really nice Italian restaurant in the area, and Scott is in studio today. He is about probably 10 feet from me right now, and the owner there always says, "Where is the tall, nice man who's so smart?" And that's Scott. He's with us today, and we are going to share in some of his smartness. Oh. Scott, how are you today?
I'm great. Thanks, Rick.
I'm glad you could make it in. And today you were going to talk about something a little bit different, design thinking.
Yes.
What is design thinking?
So design thinking is a methodology for approaching problems. It's using the power of design to solve very specific needs of specific individuals. To give you an example, you might have learners, for example, that need to learn a new process. Using design, you could actually approach the problem with them and really make your product, your output, more inspiring.
Now, design thinking isn't what people think it is. Immediately when you say design, people think graphics and video, and
yes. It's
different, really.
Yeah, design thinking is actually a term that came out of Stanford, their D school or design school. And it's used at large companies and smaller companies to approach problems, and it's as an approach. And so Ideate, which is very well known for creating new products or new services or even new experiences, has used design thinking extensively. And they're not the only one. Citrix, one of my former employers, uses design thinking to prototype new experiences too.
So it's almost more of a process.
It is, and it's encompassed in the acronym EDIPT, E-D-I-P-T. Empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test.
Okay. Ideate. That reminds me of that IBM commercial. What are you guys doing? We're ideating.
Ideating, yes.
And the guy's like, uh-huh.
It sounds better than than brainstorming.
So you mentioned empathy.
Yes, that's the first pillar of design thinking, and it's probably one of the most important. If you think of design as being something that solves a problem for a specific individual, empathy is the connection to that individual. It's frequently one of the reasons that work product might be boring or might be not compelling for people is because it's not actually designed with a specific individual in mind. And so empathy allows you to get out there and do some research, some interviewing, and ask very open-ended questions to begin to better understand the person that you're designing for.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because one of the key things in customer service, for example, is having empathy for the clients. And whoever you're doing design for or developing for, they are your clients, whether they're internal or external. We did something for the County of Los Angeles, which had about 110,000 employees, originally for health services, because that's one of the most outward-facing of the departments they have. They service, I think it's close to 10 million people in the county. That's a lot of people.
Yeah.
And they were having horrible reviews as to how well they were servicing people. People were angry when they left the county. And so we came up with the principle of SMILE, another acronym. Service means involvement, listening, and empathy. And the empathy was so crucial to it, because until they put themselves in the place of the patient or whatever county department they were going through, they really didn't understand what was going on or why they were even servicing the people. One of the key things that came out of that training, and we trained about 100 people. These were all train-the-trainer type situations. They went forth and then trained all of their employees and county workers. One thing that they never really understood is that they are a service organization and that they don't make any money. They collect money. And collecting money put them at odds with the people who felt, well, you took my money, why don't I get anything out of it? And so that's part of what the training was. You do collect money. You have to be empathetic to that. They expect something for that money they've given you. When the lights came on, all of a sudden it made sense, and it went from training 30,000 people to 110,000. It went countywide. And it was very successful because the amount of lawsuits, the amount of complaints dramatically dropped. For example, in a hospital line, and this is empathy, and I'm sort of not taking too much away from this, but the whole idea was they would go in a clinic, let's say a county clinic, they would have people walk outside and talk to the patients as they're waiting in line because there's a lot of people waiting. They would get them comfortable. They would understand what's going on with you. Oh, that's really bad. You know, how long have you had that? When you get inside, let me take you to the right people. And what a difference that made. It was amazing. And I imagine some of the processes you've been through, and I'm very familiar with the work of Citrix, for example, and GoToMeeting and GoToMyPC where you were involved. Very good user interfaces, very, something that you just feel good about. It's like they know what your problem is and you're solving it.
Yeah, we try to make it intuitive. The sort of mandate behind GoToMeeting, for example, is it's a product that you can use without ever having to read a user manual.
That's true.
You can just immediately, if you understand basics of recording or voice or playing play buttons like on a tape recorder, which is an old school thing for those of you who are too young to know what that is. You can use GoToMeeting. And so the product was designed with people in mind and very specific individuals. And empathy is really important, as you sort of pointed out. It's been used by, for example, Ideate did a big case study where they used, it was a hospital too, but they actually filmed the process of going through being a patient at a hospital from beginning to end in a way to create empathy for those patients that are going through the process. And it was such an eye-opening experience for so many of the medical care professionals who are just focused on their job or just focused on their function to see end-to-end how challenging and confusing and frustrating the process was, and then ultimately how amazing it could be if things were just changed a little bit.
You know, there was a movie years ago, when you brought that up, I thought of it. It was Regarding Henry.
Yeah.
It was a movie, who was in that one?
Harrison Ford?
It was Harrison Ford.
Yeah.
That's what I thought. He was a doctor who winds up becoming sick. And now he has to put up with everything he had to go through.
Yeah.
And it completely changed his life. It was a very good movie. If you want to learn about empathy and learn about how the other people feel and how you're being treated, watch that movie. It would be a good exercise for any marketing class or anybody who's dealing with people, to put yourself in the shoe of that other person. It was quite a good movie. He was a real schmuck. I mean, he was not a nice guy. And
no,
then
I remember
how he changes because of the treatment he got that he used to give people. It was pretty good. Kind of like a Scrooge story for Christmas, but told in a hospital setting. It was quite interesting. So what's the next step after empathy? Because empathy is, I guess, laying the groundwork for what problem needs to be solved.
Yeah, so when you're building empathy, what you're doing is you're interviewing specific kinds of users. Those are sort of on the extremes. That's how you learn the most. And so you might, for example, let's say your problem is you want to get more people to use a specific product or to go through your training and actually enjoy it. You might interview somebody who signed up for the training but never even attended, and then you might interview somebody who went through the training and gave it high marks. And in those two extremes, you'll find a range of insights, and that's what empathy allows you to do, is to begin to collect the information that you need to do your design work.
Well, what I like about your approach also is you're dealing with the problem right up front at the people level.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's usually pretty a good guarantee of much better success, because that's not the last step. That's actually your first step.
It is. And so I'm going to actually walk you through an example of how we did this. One of the things that I focused on early in my career was trying to improve the onboarding experience for brand new users. And these were people who, in many cases, never actually used the product. They would sign up for a trial. They'd go through all the expense in terms of time to sign up for a trial of a product like GoToMeeting, and then they wouldn't actually use the product. And it was baffling to me as to why that would ever happen. And we got a ton of insights through the empathy stage to be able to figure that out. And to give you an example, one of the things we discovered in the next phase, which is the define phase. So once you do all of your interviews, then you go back and you collect and you use that information to figure out a few different things. You're trying to figure out the external things, like what people are saying and actually doing. Those are externally visible. But you're also trying to figure out insights around what people are thinking or feeling. And so what we did in that particular case was we realized one of the big issues that people had with GoToMeeting was they didn't want to embarrass themselves in front of their bosses. And they would sign up for the product, but then they wouldn't want to be on a meeting and have their boss see them not know what they're doing. And so they would have this avoidance of using the product as a result. And that was just one of the insights from one type of user, but really, really helpful in terms of figuring out how do you approach that person and create a solution that works better for them.
That's great. So what's the next step in the process?
So after define, and define really is the say, do, think, feel. Once you've got your ideas behind that, the next area is to ideate, or to begin to brainstorm solutions for the problem as you've defined it. And so the problem statement might look something like, so-and-so needs a X in order to do Y. Once you've got that problem statement, though, now you need to start coming up with ideas for how do you solve it? How do you make it better for somebody? And so that might involve a detailed brainstorming where you get as much a broad scope of ideas on the table as you possibly can. So you might have a team of people, give them 5 minutes and tell them they have to put up 100 Post-it notes with different types of crazy, insane, interesting ideas. You'll get out ideas that are obvious to you, and you'll get out things that are just not even technically possible. It doesn't matter. At this stage, there's no bad idea. At this stage, you're supposed to answer the question with yes and, meaning if you were to say, I think the solution is to put a man on the moon by building a ladder out of spaghetti, the next person might have to say yes, and we should make sure there's no sauce on the spaghetti. But the goal is to get as many ideas on the table and not shut things down with criticism or early judgment.
That's so funny, because when I learned how to do brainstorming, it was more in a typical banking environment. Actually, it was insurance, and it was brutal. This is New York, so it was more like you had a devil's advocate in the group. You had somebody who basically knocked every idea down. The idea was you fought for your idea. The idea was very different from what you're saying. It worked too. I mean, because some of the ideas were just kind of like the spaghetti one. Somebody would go, "What, are you stupid? Let's go on to the next one." And it was tough, but it was good because it kept you on your feet. I've been in meetings today where sometimes they're not doing design thinking. They're just coming up with really ridiculous ideas without there's no empathy. It's like, why do we do this? It's like, no. I mean, let's bring it back to reality. But I could see the point of what you're saying, because by allowing the creative process to flow, it gets people out of the fear stage of even thinking of coming up with something.
Yep. People will lock up if you start to criticize them. And that'll happen, for example, in hierarchies, too, where you've got a power structure where your boss is in the room during the brainstorming, and now you're suddenly afraid to throw out an idea because you wouldn't want to sound dumb in front of your boss. So you've got to break that down, and the only way to break it down is to sort of get to a yes and mindset.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense.
So once you get past the ideation stage and you've got a ton of ideas, the next stage is to prototype. And prototyping really involves, it can be, the goal behind prototyping is to come up with a solution that's as low resolution as possible while still giving people an idea of what the solution looks like. The next stage, obviously, after that is once you've got your prototype, you want to test. You want to get it back in front of the user and see what insights you can pick up. In some cases, you'll find out you actually got the problem statement wrong. You didn't understand correctly the person's needs, so you made some false assumptions when you're doing your prototyping, and that will come up during your testing phase. But we've used this approach a number of different ways, and I'll give you an example. So during the prototyping phase of trying to come up with a better trade show booth experience, we actually had a room of people who enacted the trade show booth in a conference room, and we would bring in customers after interviewing them, and we would run them through a scenario or an approach of what would the trade show booth look like? How would people interact? And so, for example, one of our more popular concepts was we created a game, a real live game with huge pieces of Jenga. And you could move these Jenga pieces and play in the booth on screen. And at the same time, the game of Jenga was being monitored by this software product that the company I worked for made. So you could actually see who was winning, and all these, and you could make it extremely flexible. The goal was not because people want to monitor Jenga games, but the goal was that if you can monitor a game of Jenga, you can monitor anything. And we wanted to get across how flexible the solution was. And so we went through this process of bringing people in, showing them this game of Jenga, and then getting their feedback. Would they play the game of Jenga? How would they feel if they saw this happening? If other people were doing it in front of them, would they be engaged or disengaged? If you're a customer, what's your experience versus what's your experience as a prospect? And it was very, very different and very insightful all the way through.
Now, how did that work on the whole? What was the end result of that game?
So we came up with some new concepts. One of the key things that we learned was that customers come to your booth for very, very different reasons than new prospects. But frequently, we were designing the whole experience simply for new prospects. If you didn't need a piece of collateral, new prospects might need a piece of collateral about a product that they don't have, but your customers already know that product. They may be looking for tips on how to take things to the next level. And if you don't have that piece of collateral with you, you're not serving their needs. And so we came to realize that there was actually a two-pronged strategy that's required for every trade show booth that we created.
That's interesting. I remember, and you were there at the time, I'm pretty sure, when I used to go to meeting booth or go to training booth that Citrix would have at some of the trade shows. There were some definite techniques that you could feel as you got there. I remember somebody would ask a question, and based on your answer, you would get guided very quickly to someone else who had an answer. So you had like the front level, it's like going into a fort. You had your front level that defended the fort, and then the second level got you into the actual commanders you needed to talk to. I actually found that very effective because within a minute or two, you're talking to somebody who you need to talk to.
Yeah.
And that was a good strategy. Not everybody does that in booths. I've been in many booths, and I've worked in a lot of booths. I've worked in the Adobe booth for, I think, 3 years. I've worked with iSpring for a couple of years. I even helped Trivantis on the last occasion. And I actually enjoy doing booths. It's fun. And everybody handles booths differently, and the way people come into booths is very different. For example, when I was with Adobe, working the booth as a guest, it's because I was on the Adobe Captivate board at one time, it was really to get attacked by a lot of users who weren't happy. So there was a lot of, I really hate this. I go, I understand. I feel your pain. And you had to just kind of disarm people a little bit. I'll tell you one story I had once at the, this was at a Learning Solutions show, and there was this little lady. She was very, very small, kind of frizzy hair, comes up to me. Well, she goes up to somebody else and goes, I'm really unhappy with this product. And I went up to her and I go, excuse me, you don't look like a lady that's unhappy about much of anything. She goes,
and did that work?
Believe it or not, she came back 4 times to the booth. Where's the guy with the nice voice? He's really nice. I like him. And I got her by just kind of joking with her up front with the, well, you don't seem like anybody. It got a conversation going, which wasn't all of a sudden aggressive. It was, I'm joking with her a little bit. I pulled her out of her misery for a moment to find out what her misery was. Mm-hmm. And then we found out her misery wasn't that bad a misery, she didn't know how to use it.
Ah, okay.
And then when we got to that, she came back literally 4 times. And I was laughing because I go, there she is again. And we established a communication at that point. And she was now willing to learn about what she didn't know rather than complain about it.
But you had to shake her up a little bit in order to get there.
You know, if nothing else, pull her out of that anger into something that was a little different.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And it worked, and it just got her attention. And there's no mystery to that. It's just talking to people, and sometimes humor, even at the wrong moment, may actually work because you're trying to snap someone out of that. Where was I? Because most of the time people just go into this fit. And at that point, they're raging. They're not really paying attention to anything other than their emotional need at that moment. So if you understand that, I guess it goes back to empathy. If you feel that, then you can talk to them and try to bring them around, and then you start ideating, I guess. You define what's your problem, and then you ideate. How do you figure out how to solve your problem? Mm-hmm. And so let's move on with your process. This is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, so I've walked through all 5 of the stages, but I can deep dive into any of the ones that people might have questions about. I think one of the more common questions people might have is around the prototyping phase, just because low resolution, we did this with a group of software designers. Low resolution to a software designer was to go out and build code and sit there for days trying to build up wireframes that people could go through.
Yeah.
And when I say low resolution, I'm not talking about that. I'm actually saying, you might actually have to represent an iPad, you might actually have a tablet, but then put Post-it notes all over the tablet and have people go through the experience of during your testing phase of seeing that tablet. And so you don't actually, when you're doing the final phase, which is the testing phase, you're not actually telling people what it is you're doing. You're not describing as you go through, which is one of the common mistakes that people make. You're providing an experience. So you would say, here's what you're confronted with. What would you do? And they would look at it and they would say, oh, well, I would click this. And then you'd say, okay. And then you would take a Post-it note off, change some things around, hand it back to them. And here's what you see. Now what do you do? And how would you react, and what are your thoughts, and how do you feel about this? And as you start to get into those kinds of questions, you'll start to come up with really, really great insights about whether you're actually solving the person's problem and whether you've attacked the right problem to begin with.
Interesting. I remember I worked with a company, eHelp, back then. Now they're part of Adobe, which makes RoboHelp, which is Windows-based help software. Mm-hmm. But they were also doing a thing called RoboDemo at the time, which later, several years later, became Captivate. And they would have an interesting, and that's the first time I'd actually gone into this technique. Silke Fleischer was their product manager, and I don't know if she developed it or she just learned it when she was in school. She's a very bright girl. And it was, you get into a room with all the people on in this case, whatever board we had. And she would give everybody Monopoly money. We had play money. We had $100 of Monopoly money. That money we could buy features with. These were new features of the product that were going to come out. And so now all of a sudden you've got hard cash. Now this feature is worth something. How much is it really worth to you? Mm-hmm. And the technique was interesting because people who were really saying, I want this, all of a sudden, well, I don't know if I want to put money on that. It made people stop. It made people stop and think, where do I want to invest my money to get some return out of it?
Yeah.
And even though it's play money, it's amazing how people go, it's still money. I want to do something with this. And it worked. And we were able to get better features in the software out of just kind of a little trick game. But it was an interesting approach to how do you make, because everybody, when you ask people, what do you want in the next software? Everybody wants everything.
Right.
But when you start delimiting them, how do you get them to say, well, okay, now can you bring that? What do you really want? Everything. Well, no. What do you really, really want? Everything? Okay, now you got money. What are you going to do with it? Well, okay, well, I can't have everything? No. Well, you can. You could put $100 on one thing. But then you're done. You have no more opinion.
That's a great way of attacking these kinds of problems, and that's actually a good example of a constraint. Imposing a constraint on people to force them to prioritize or force them to think in new ways. And in design thinking, we use constraints a lot to require people to think outside the box. And so you might, for example, impose a time limit on a group, require people change team members or other things to be able to go through the process and really come up with new ideas, fresh things that you haven't seen before.
You know, I have to tell you, when you just said think outside the box, it reminded me of my wife, Leslie. I used that term a lot in the old days when I was doing lectures or talking, and I would say, you know, we really should think outside the box. And one day she goes, what box are we talking about? Well, it's a kind of allegorical, theoretical box. I don't see a box. Right. There's really no box. It's the box we constrain ourselves with. Why? And it wound up being an Abbott and Costello kind of routine, comedians, but it was talk about a round conversation going round and round. I just gave us, forget it, you don't have a box, just keep moving. It was just better that way. But it's interesting because a lot of people go, well, they use the term think outside the box, but they don't really quite know what it means. And I have found that out in corporate cultures I've been in, where they're all going, we need to think. What do you want to think about? Things. Like what? Things that could help.
So they don't define the problem. For example, they don't come up with any constraints at all or any
no.
structure.
They just have this. IBM had that in the old days when I think his name was Watson. When he was there, actually it was Watson. They called their new computer Watson. That's sort of interesting. All over IBM there were big signs saying "think."
Right.
Now, think on its own is not a call to action.
Right.
It's just a word. So people, and after a while, they see it 100,000 times. Thinking doesn't mean anything. So I think the idea was like you said, it had no constraints. Think. So invariably, when I've done groups in the past, I would say, think about what? And they would kind of go, I don't know. Well, what would you want to think about? Vacation? Okay, valid. What else would you want to think about? How are your job conditions? I don't know. So you start trying to get out, what do you really want to think about? What are we trying to reach? So I think, like you mentioned, you have to have a goal. Without a goal, thinking doesn't really necessarily get you to anywhere because you could be splattered everywhere and nowhere. So I thought the IBM approach back then was interesting. I don't know how effective it was, other than getting people to know that there's a word called think out there, and that maybe we should be thinking. It's sort of interesting. We work with one client that has the tagline of "engage with us," and my comment to one of their people was, "Shouldn't it be engage together? Let's engage." I go, semantically, engage with us puts you in the engaging, controlling situation.
Right.
They were thinking about that one. But it is semantics. It's how the word is interpreted, how it's applied. And boy, can you get different meanings out of one word or one sentence when you talk to 10 different people.
That's one of the things that I notice a lot with some of the interviews that we would do is we would completely misunderstand what people were saying because they thought the word meant something else. Or if you have, and this is one of the key secrets to being successful, you have multiple interviewers, so you can get a sanity check. You can find out that only one person in the room believes that the person meant this, and then everybody else thought they meant something else, and it gives you a chance to drill down later and go back and ask some more questions. So,
and what's fascinating about that is oftentimes that one person who's misinterpreting or going in a different direction may actually be the only one in the right direction.
Exactly.
Which is really a fascinating exercise in human thought and also crowd mentality, because a lot of times people answer what they think they're supposed to answer. So you always want as big a sampling as you can, because then you start weeding out the followers, the joiners who don't really care, they just want to be part of the group, and or the people who want those features. Okay, for example, in e-learning, everybody wants mobile learning.
Yes.
Do they know why? No, a lot of them don't. They just think it's a great idea because everybody else wants it or has it.
Or it's the buzzword of the day. Or
it's a buzzword, too. And how many companies...
It's very important.
We dealt with a company recently. We actually didn't win this account. But it was interesting. We didn't win the account because they said we knew too much. And I was going, knew too much? That's a new one. Wow. Because we asked questions. And the questions we asked were, you want mobile. Okay, understood. But we're talking software simulation on all the training you're now talking about. Software simulation in a mobile environment is very different from your desktop because you can't fit a normal data entry screen on a device and read it. It's too small. And I asked them, do you have mobile applications now? And they went, what would that be? It would be having the application that's on your desktop in a mobile format already ready to be entered in an easier manner. No. Do you have any mobile applications? None. Then why do you want mobile training for your software? We don't know. And literally, that was the answer. We don't know.
Yeah.
Then why are you making that part of the RFP? I don't know. So it turned ugly. In a way, it's like going down that rabbit hole all of a sudden became a point of insecurity.
Yeah.
But as a consultant, our job is to make sure they understand why they want to do something before they just jump off and waste a lot of money. And in this case, it didn't work out. But ideally, sometimes you have to say, stop, hold it. If you're planning for the future, got it. But if you have nothing right now and you're not planning anything for the future, what is the purpose of it? And it's asking the questions. It's the emperor has no clothes. Nobody wants to be told they have no clothes, but on the other hand, can you waste people's money? One time I remember we did a bid against Accenture, which is a really large consulting firm. And the RFP was completely unintelligible. There was no idea what anybody really wanted. But they wanted a bid, fast. We came up with 150,000, mostly made up numbers, because we had no idea what they really wanted and they wouldn't answer questions. They came up with 1.5 million and got it. We're going, wow. That's pretty good. They must have had a universal translator for that RFP because there's no way you had any information. Of course, subsequently, they lost and got fired for it. But, you know, that's the funny thing. You can bid an enormous amount and people go, wow, that must be really a good solution. Yeah, but if your problem is not defined up front, your solution is also undefined. And that's exactly what happened.
I think the other interesting thing about what you're talking about is you're talking about the difference between what people say they want or say and what they actually want or what they do.
And what they need, maybe.
And what they really need. And there's often a discrepancy there. People, in many cases, won't tell the truth or they won't make the connection because of, for example, status. They don't want to appear to lose status, so they're not going to say that this is the reason that they're doing it. But it actually is. I'll give you an example.
I have a perfect example of that. When I was vice president of IT at a large publishing firm, I was responsible for buying a fourth generation software package. What those were non-programming packages per se, but they were software that would build things for you. A lot of objects were already defined, and you really had to connect things and make things work together. A little bit of coding, but that was for advanced things. And we went to buy a product, and we saw all the demos, and we got it. Except the demos were all fake. They were not real product, which is not a very good software thing to do.
No, it's not.
And we tried working with it for about 2 months, and I said, this isn't working. And I remember my programming manager would go, yeah, this is pretty screwed up. What are we going to do? I go, I'm going to talk to the president and say, we made a mistake. We got conned. And he goes, well, I wouldn't do that. Why? He goes, you're going to get blamed for it. I go, it's my fault. So, at that point, it stops with me. I made the decision. I paid the $100,000 check for that product. And we did that. We called the vendor into our boardroom. We had the president there. We had the VP of finance, a couple of other people. And at the end of it was a very civil meeting. And at the end of it all, the guy says, well, how do you feel? You won. You got your money back. I go, no, we all lost. Nobody won. We all lost. And he was like, oh. I go, you lost probably more because you don't have a very good reputation out there. We lost because we wasted time, and I believed you. But ultimately, we all lost. No, there was no winner in that one. He had a hard time figuring that one out. He goes, what, isn't there always a winner? No. No, in this case, everybody lost something. Do you lose credibility? Do you lose respect? Do you lose... it doesn't really matter. You lose something. And then you have to make it up. You have to build the trust back up in different ways to get back to not being the person making mistakes. And that was a big mistake. And we got around it, and we bought different software, and everything was fine. We managed to make up the 2 months we lost in flight, and everything was good. But the thing is, in a management arena, how many managers are willing to admit a mistake? Not a lot.
Yeah, it's tough to do because
it is tough.
All these consequences for doing so. But
Yeah.
it's so important to maintain their sort of authenticity.
You know, I never forget Ross Perot one time fired his VP of, I don't know what he was. He was one of the VPs when he was a GM. And he flat out fired him. The guy was having an affair. And Ross Perot said, you know what, if I can't trust you, no one can. And he fired him. No, he said, if your wife can't trust you, I can't, for sure. And he fired him. And he went, whoa. Talk about a consequence there.
Yeah.
He obviously knew about the tryst that was going on, and he said, no, I'm not putting up with it, because that means you're capable of being distrustful with me, too. Now, in a management scene today, you don't see a lot of that. It's Ross Perot was an old Navy officer, and he had his black and white way of looking at life, and he's made billions doing that. So I guess for him it worked out, but it was an interesting call, and it was something that definitely required guts to do.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what you're talking about with the processes and the thinking design or design thinking is at every stage of that process, from what I was hearing, there's accountability, there's responsibility, and there's a common focus of where you want to go.
Yeah, I think the entire team that's doing the design, they're all aligned around a problem, and it needs to be a problem that motivates them and inspires them. That needs to be something. It needs to be something worth solving. Design thinking can be used, for example, to come up with an answer to the problem of malaria. It can be used to come up with answers to some of the world's biggest problems, or even smaller things. It's just a question of what inspires you, what will get the best work out of you as a designer.
There was one funny thing. When you mentioned malaria, it just reminded me of something really ridiculous. When I lived in Argentina, this is many years ago, there was actually this one talk, and it was hilarious. So they had this kind of design meeting at this company, and they were trying to figure out how to solve problems with flies, because they had mosquitoes and flies like you wouldn't believe. And someone came up with an idea of putting a whole ring of manure around this huge area. And that would attract the flies, and they wouldn't bother us. I was going, okay, very interesting. What about disease and other problems? I didn't think about that. They'd just do this whole big... And so the solutions were hilarious. They were just... What comes out of it sometimes is just sort of, okay, that's a good one.
But you have to use yes and if you're in the ideation phase.
Yeah, yes and? What else do we do after this?
Yes, we'll use a ring of manure and...
And what did you find were the biggest challenges in applying design thinking to a project?
I think the bigger challenges were it's counterintuitive in many cases. You're trying to think and understand what somebody else is looking for, and in many cases you're radically different than the person that you're trying to empathize with. And so I think the biggest challenge would be not fully understanding the person that you're designing for. And I'm sure that affects e-learning developers, for example, because they're developing, they're under a time crunch. They've got a very specific set workload, and maybe they're super busy. And so the idea of taking design thinking and trying to apply it to what they do may seem difficult too, because of the constraints. They're worried about time. But if they spend 10 hours or 12 hours developing something for somebody, and it turns out it wasn't solving the problem, it doesn't get any engagement from their learners, then they've lost out on a huge opportunity when they could have spent a little more time up front using an approach like design thinking to come up with a much better work product.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's just a little extra time. There's an old saying I learned years ago when I was 19. At the time, it made no sense to me. If you have to hurry, hurry slowly. At 19, it's like, huh? What? See you later. I'm rushing off to something. But it really makes a lot of sense. And it's that whole idea. Stop, think, wait. Make sure you make... I know it doesn't work in everything, but it works in a lot of things in life. If you have to hurry, take that time. It's a tortoise and hare kind of idea of just taking that little extra time. You may get there at the same speed as someone else, and your solution may be better.
Yeah, I mean, the goal is to come up with a solution that people actually feel great about. You were talking about IBM and Think, but that really overemphasizes one part of people's personalities. People's how they feel about things is really the difference between action and inaction in a lot of cases.
That's true. Yeah.
And so I like where you're going with that.
That's true. And how people feel really does make a difference in how they produce, because a lot of times we're solving problems, and like you said, we're solving a problem. We're getting to a solution, but oftentimes we're missing key factors in that solution. Either we don't have enough constraints on the problem, or we don't really identify the whole problem. And one of the biggest problems with solving problems, especially within corporations trying to figure out what they want to do with something, is the mirror never looks back at themselves.
Yes.
And that's often the problem. Their own process, their own people, their attitudes, the loyalty. You know, what's the old saying? You know, the beatings will continue until morale improves. and you know, that's a joke, but that's not necessarily untrue in some places. And and so you look at that and go, what are we solving? Okay, there's a customer problem, but obviously the customer problem is often generated by the vendor, or at least the perception of. So how does the manufacturer, the distributor, the financial service company, the developer, how do they solve the problem for the end user, the customer, the client, when the problem may be the vendor themselves? If you have a software company, for example, that develops poor software, they develop buggy software.
Not us, in other words.
No, not you guys. You guys are actually very good. You know, and we're talking about Trivantis here. Very good. They're very solid. But there are companies in the e-learning space, as well as many other spaces, that develop poor quality products. Does that company put the microscope on themselves to figure out what the real problem is? Is their software buggy because the customers have stupid demands? Well, that would be one way to rationalize it.
Right. That would probably be the engineer's idea, but it's
right.
probably not going to drive a lot of action.
No, and so you're going to get people who say, well, my software is bad because of you. Okay. That would only be true if the engineering company doesn't have a firm set of requirements for what the user needs, or doesn't understand the user needs. But in reality, if the microscope's not on you at all times, you're going to be making those mistakes, because that's the one part of the equation that most companies don't try to look at too much, because that's the painful one. Do we have wrong people in this position? Do we have the wrong resources or materials in a different position? You know, do we have what we need to accomplish what's needed? And I think that's where it fails. The process can be great. The Six Sigma. You're familiar with Six Sigma, I'm sure.
I am.
Now, I actually call it Sick Sigma. SICK. In more cases, it is really a Six Sigma, because by finding problems many times, and to get a black belt, people will make up problems. They will look for problems that don't exist in the corporation. They will complicate processes just to be able to solve them, and then get your black belt, which is totally disingenuous, but that's another issue. And what happens with Six Sigma, it works in certain environments much better than in others. Like you could have Lean Six Sigma, which works better in a process environment, a services environment, more than a process environment, I should say, versus a manufacturing environment where Six Sigma can work pretty well. It was developed by Motorola really to make sure they're processing, and I believe this was during Motorola paging days, I think it started. It made them develop everything much better, and it worked beautifully for that. But when it went into the services arena, it's a whole different process. And now you've got different components. There's a much more human component in services, and you've got to look at the process in a different way. And that's where Six Sigma falls many times. And when you make the carrot the black belt, now you've ruined the opportunity of actually fixing processes, and now you're creating people who want a belt.
Yeah, it sounds like the motivations that you're creating are the real issue, and you can artificially create motivations that can cause problems in your process.
Yeah.
That's certainly an issue with any kind of management.
Yeah. So in I imagine that in the design thinking process, nothing's really off the table, and literally looking back at yourself or at the team is also part of the option.
It is. I mean, it's hard to look at your own motivations, though. It's like a fish trying to see the water that it's swimming in.
Right.
And so the lens through which you should try to focus is through the eyes of the person that you're interviewing, of the group that you're empathizing with.
You know,
and they're the ones that you're trying to solve the problem for. It's not your boss, for example. If you want to engage a learner, you go to the learners. You don't go to somebody else and try and interview them.
Right. I heard a great joke one time about this guy looking at a fish tank and he's just staring at it. And another person comes by and says, you know, superior mind always wins over inferior mind. Watch. And he looks at the fish, and the fish is starting to go every direction he makes it go in with his eyes. And then he turns around and goes, superior mind always wins. And he walks away. So the other guy's looking at the fish. The superior mind guy comes back half hour later, and the guy's looking at the fish going like this. Superior mind always wins.
I like that joke.
Yeah. It's kind of a sad reality sometimes, but
yeah, unfortunately. Unfortunately.
Well, Scott, what's new with Trivantis? Anything you can talk about right now? Or I know you guys just
we just released
Lectora Online.
Yeah, we just released Lectora Online 3 with responsive course design, and that's going really well. And we're really excited because we're going to have the desktop version with responsive course design very soon on the heels of this. And so all of our customer base will be able to design mobile-friendly courses extremely easily. And that's one of the things I'm probably most excited about.
I've been playing with the Lectora Online and the responsive design. It's really well architected. It was very well implemented. It's a tough thing to do. It's complex. It's not an easy one. And as John was telling us in last week's show, where he was talking about the grid, how you use a software grid to basically collapse and open onto itself. And it's totally fluid. It's so much more advanced and flexible than that of what you'll find in, let's say, adaptive design, which is really just creating it 4 times or 3 times over. It's really clever. And John and I were talking in last week's show. We were kidding about this. I just said, so think outside the box and work inside the grid. And he went, I like that.
Yeah, I like it too.
And it was fun because it's kind of what he's doing. I never thought of that either. It's just never really thought of a grid being collapsible like that. It's very, very clever design, and it makes a whole lot of sense. And I think as a result, we've gotten to the point where you have a very functional and actually accessible responsive design tool. And when I say accessible, it's not hard to use.
Yeah, that was the goal. I mean, ease of use for everybody, so that anybody can create a responsive course, was really the mandate for this.
And it's fun. And it's fun when you actually see it act, because it's almost, I call it magical. It looks magical, because it's doing things you don't expect. And then if you don't like the way you do it, you can go into that particular device, tweak, and you haven't lost anything. Everything still works as you wanted it across all devices. And that's sweet. That's actually pretty darn sweet. So that was actually exciting when I saw that, when John was demoing it. It's like, wow, this is cool, and that is really thinking outside the box. He came up with a different way to look at it and implement it in an e-learning manner. That was very clever.
Yeah, I think so too. And so the other things that are going on, let me think. We've got some trade shows that are coming up. We'll be at Learning Solutions and Learning Technologies in February and in March. What else? We're working on a brand new website that's going to be a process that will take probably a couple of quarters, but we're excited being able to unveil that for our customers. And then we're also working on revamping our community to make it something that's even higher value for customers. And part of the process we'll be doing as we revamp the community is actually following the design thinking process.
Ah, great. Okay. So we're going to see something in action from that.
Some customers will actually get to experience early prototypes, which will be really terrible with Post-it notes. but the goal is to come up with a work product that everybody loves and has great feelings about.
Well, that's great. Well, we'll look forward to all of that stuff, and I look forward to the desktop. You said December it's coming on?
The desktop version is due to come out in December, yes.
December, cool. That'll be a Christmas gift for everybody. That'd be great.
Yes.
Sounds good. Well, Scott, as always, I appreciate you coming out.
Thanks for having me,
Always a
Rick.
good thing. I love the topic. This is a good topic because it's something any one of us can benefit from in many ways. Hey, if people want to find out more about design thinking, where would they go?
So I would Google Stanford design thinking, and there's a great crash course video that in 80 minutes will show you exactly how to facilitate a design thinking session and all the phases that are required. And just a ton of good research information online from Stanford that I would recommend people go take a look at if they want to learn more.
That'll be great. I'll see if I can find the link to that, and I'll post it up on the show notes so people can go if they want. Because it's a common sense approach, and it sounds also like it's fun. It's good team building while you do it.
It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun when you're doing it right.
Well, Scott, again, appreciate you coming on. We look forward to seeing you next time. And if you're watching the shows on YouTube, please subscribe. And by the way, the shows are going to be on Vimeo very shortly as well. So they'll be in both places. And subscribe twice. You can watch the show 2 times. We don't mind. Have a good one. We will see you next week on Lectora Live. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.